Well, thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for coming to this exhibition. It's the first time Yunuen and I and Elizabeth are curating something here at the Philosophical Research Society, so we're super excited to present this show. Well done. Okay, so I am gonna do a kind of an introduction to something I've been thinking about around the idea of when putting these works together. The idea of the present and the delay between an idea of the present and the contemporary. I run Cassandra Press, which is a really lo-fi publication platform. We basically steal academic texts and republish them. I bootleg a lot of academia, sort of common knowledge, editorial stuff, and make these textbooks called readers on certain themes. I guess what is really important, I think, to start off this talk with is an idea of why to do this show here and why to do the show now. And for me, a big part of why a show like this is really necessary sort of starts with a text I'm going to read to you from Wolfgang Ernst, from a book that has a very long title, but a very sort of relevant spiral title, The Delayed Present, Media-Induced Temporalities and Techno-Traumatic Irritations of the Contemporary. It's a big mouthful for how we're all spiraling on social media. So I want to take this introduction that I'll read to you now and talk about what he says is sort of this idea of liberal coexistence and then a dominance of a techno-logic. So I'm going to sort of confront Wolfgang's theory that he expresses here and say that the irritation is actually caused by a sort of fallacy of the liberal coexistence of signals, echoes, reverbs, and after images. Okay, so Wolfgang. As indicated by the current avant-garde topics like the post-contemporary, new chronopoetical practices not only emerge on a micro-technical level, but increasingly spread into everyday practices of the technological regime. The symbolic ordering of time into past, present, and future is ever more compressed into one dense time window of the extended present. In that sense, the current condition is literally contemporary. An interlacing of temporalizing gestures on the one hand, there is an instant, quote, archiving of the present in digital processing, while on the other hand, the past is immediately coupled with the actual present in online communication, the represencing of the archive. Even the imminent future is already pre-calculated in real time, a futurum exactum, i.e. your algorithm. The grammar of language allows the expression of this shift. The past is not imperfect anymore, but becomes historically perfect, residually enduring within the present. The future is not simply what is to come, but what can be preemptively anticipated, a future in the past. In communication engineering, such temporal forms of formulation in terms of the chronotechnical channel are formulated in terms of the chronotechnical channel as the delayed present. So I want to read another short quote from another voice that I think is sort of bringing, bringing this idea that Wolfgang presents as the chronopoetic into the contemporary. Did I lose anybody in that quote? Okay. Chronopoetic. So chronopoetic, I think, for me, is this idea of the poetic of linking threads, times, durations. I mean, if you want to put it in a really contemporary way, I'm putting it in a contemporary way, it's your feed, this idea of your feed, also the coupling of those metaphors, feed, signal, echo, reverb, this idea of the live, this idea of Facebook Live, what is that? That's where's the signal, where's the origin, so there's a poetic almost to sort of like meme culture, how it's sort of grabbing elements of the past, mixing them into contemporary news, there's a poetic almost forming in the expression of how we're experiencing this delay and this sort of density of the time window. Does that make sense?
Well, does the chrono prefix?
Time. Yeah. So it's this playing around with times and spaces. I mean, it's kind of a chronopoetic gesture. But then to sort of take this back to almost the avant-garde, cool sort of Marxist critique from the Society of the Spectacle, De Boer writes, what is constantly new in the process of production of things is not found in consumption, which remains the expanded repetition of the same. In spectacular times, since dead labor continues to dominate living labor, the past dominates the present. So I want to think about this, like this sort of like society of spectacle that we live in right now, and the images, the archives that we're working with, and how we are using like a contemporary technological advancements and platforms to introduce new sort of ways of like imagining the temporal, which I think all the works in this show do. So yeah, so talk about the coexistence, the fallacy of the coexistence. Where I disagree with Wolfgang is that I don't believe these are technological irritations of the contemporary. These are expressions of the contemporary that are like absorbing the growing pains and the shocks of having so many marginalized and repressed and erased communities participate en masse all at once in the represencing of the archive, in representation and overrepresentation of images of, say, everything you can think of from, you know, the lynched person, the erased Native American, the Orientalist past, all of these margins of identity that are now flooding our populist spaces, our populist speaking spaces, are reimagining the like archive of this lost past.
I can kind of jump into it in terms of distance. I think the literal distance of not fragmenting the body in like in my work, but then also you get a distance from me showing my body as being still, but then a distance from the moment of stillness, which you often see in these kind of videos of someone being shot, as you see everything leading up to that moment. But what does that do if we take away that moment and we just have just the body that, it kind of puts the body in that context of almost, of still being alive. And then I also think there's some distance, I think, particularly in like the Acedia series and like the distance of technology by having that more digital kind of frame, the more like vertical frame rather than like a horizontal, kind of more filmic, scopic idea. That kind of puts us in that distance from personhood that you might see like the actual video in, and kind of relates it to that.
So the decision of the video piece for my work is that I wanted to take on the act of reestablishing or like carrying my mom on my back in a piggyback like style of taking on her weight, but then also kind of acknowledging an act of like intimacy between my mother and I. But in order to together like enter the space of this time and this history of what my mother lived through.
តែគេក្រោះនេះចឹងគេយកទៅកសាងយ៉ាគេចាប់យកទៅធ្វើអីទៅមកតាមយកទៅវិញទៅកន្លែងដើមវិញហ្នឹងតែគេអត់ស្លាប់អីគេគ្រាន់តែនេះចឹងទៅគេយកទៅកសាងមកគេឲ្យមកបានន័យគេ what was that mean កសាងហ្នឹងបានន័យថាដូចកូនធ្វើអីខុសចឹងណា
but it's shot just simply on like a tripod from a very wide and far distance. And in some way, I myself feel very distant and like a generation removed from the genocide and a generation after that trauma, but then still living through the real and the residue of it, but being very much in the wake of that, the present, how, what you said earlier, that history dominates the present. But really trying to, in a literal sense, take on her weight and really acknowledging the weight of these histories that binds us together in a way that I think the wide shot and the odd, but what you see is just like very small figures, and then you see that my figure is holding my mother's figure, but what you're really seeing is us sprawled in this Kentucky landscape where my family lived and were relocated to. Or where they reside now, but trusting that the audio and that the listening to the stories that my mom is telling to me, that in some way I think invokes a lot of kind of the tradition of oral traditions of how histories are passed down in that sense as well, and that trusting that these are new ways of archiving these histories that have been erased or And so I think distance in some way provides, is that act of stripping away, but also allowing a sense of some semblance of scratching at clarity in these stories as well.
Really interesting, like the distance from trauma. I feel like we really try to distance ourselves from our parents' trauma and like generational trauma when it's like ever present on us, you know? And it's like, it's really nice to see it really delicately played out. I think you do a really good job of that, especially like considering your parents. Like you really like take them on your back, like in so many ways. And it's like the trauma comes with it. And as much as we don't want that, it's like, it's really present. And you do a really good job of, it's really present on you, but because of the distance of the camera, I feel like I really feel that like as well, like that kind of viewership of someone else's trauma and having distance from that. I feel like it's really like,
Yeah, one thing that I've been thinking about too with like all of these videos is how this sort of like this, like, this recapturing, this represencing, this archiving, micro-archiving almost, like is so, it confronts this idea of synchronization too. Like if there's like, almost as if there's like that sort of binary between marginal and like mainstream or dominant, it's like synchronization versus improvisation. And like within the marginal community, or within marginal bodies, you know, like are used to this constant improv in terms of like all of our like sort of traumatic experiences with the state, with the self, and with history. There's a constant sense. I mean, Logan talks about this too with like Black women, but like in being in a constant state of improvisation and of being in a constant state of almost like a fugitivity or a hyper humanness or a degraded sense of humanity. Like there's always this sense of how to present. What distance is necessary to present trauma, like, and to present the encounter of trauma. And then there's like this idea of synchronization, which like also becomes this sort of fallacy of like the coexistence of different signals, where like, almost like, I mean, I'm going to use white supremacy again as an ideology because it's so intense in this country, but like, the idea that like it's almost like this idea of how things become unseen, how things are normalized, you know, and reified is almost as similar to how we understand synchronization, how we understand like the very quick push a button present, you know. We're not seeing the sort of machinations of a very calculated sense of time and data and prescriptive like kind of actions being like pushed upon us in that moment. But that again too, I think, is like one of those metaphors that are inherited from white supremacy. This instantaneous, this kind of now, that actually just doesn't understand the machinations between origin, echo, like the wall and the listener, you know? But then like, in almost like every marginal body understands that because of like, let me to go to your practice again too, like a necessity of self-defense, the necessity of the preservation, like, and I was saying of this sort of like of the second generation or being a generation removed, there's a sense of like the necessity of silence, you know, in order to preserve the next generation. And then this idea also of clarity, you know, like this constant search for a kind of truth, if you're not well born, is like gymnastics, you know, like the ever-present spiral.
I would say too, I felt kind of the opposite of what Yunuen Rhi was saying, creating our video piece with the collage aspect, in that it felt almost more like being on the opposite side of this conflict, of being the one pressing the button, and very much so in case of a collage where it's very calculated decisions of saying, I want this to measure up to this, and there is that removal and that distance, but it comes to this point of seeing bodies as exactly that, just bodies. And that limitation that is created through, essentially through anything visual, is what, to me, like the video piece, at first it made me feel kind of dirty, to be honest. Like, and I mean, the other thing too is like pulling the resources for all of that, watching the news footage and having to put aside my emotions ultimately, because on one hand it's like, yeah, I'm seeing all this footage of just then and now of people being persecuted and being treated as the bodies that we were describing, but then also ultimately thinking, well, I want the angle to be a little bit better here. we are still always in that mindset where we can infiltrate almost the same oppressive side that we are fighting against in that shaping and that molding. And as far as like trying to explore the trauma, I think you can go so far into exploring the trauma that you inflict more trauma onto yourself and the audience, and I think that's the very dangerous thing, especially with, you know, these works, because it is like almost a sort of martyrdom that we're doing as artists. And the question then is to what end? And I think that's something that martyrdom ends up profiting others outside of that. And again, it's that constant using our bodies as the tools, as the weapons, but to what end? And with, you know, the collage aspect too, I think, you know, any video editing has an element of collage into it. Just again, simply deciding like, I want this video to be this long, or I want to cut here. All those moments of decisiveness are what put us in these moments where I felt this idea of the well-born, of the eugenics, of these calculations and this sort of sterileness is something that is so buried into our very notion of progression, even within our notions of progression within, in this case, you know, the space that we're inhabiting right now, the pursuit of knowledge, there can still be a kind of sterility that I think we need to be very conscious of, because you can ascend to a certain point, you know, you can get your best grade, or you can make the video, you can make the show, but to what end again? And that's what you were saying too, that sort of echo, because the echo can only exist once the voice is, you know, out there, right?
Exactly, it has to hit a wall.
Exactly, yeah.
And also, it kind of brings up another point about the something Wolfgang Arndt brings up too, which is that these sort of transmissions, because they, like we were talking about outside a little bit, the noise of a radio chatter, you know, produces its own index of authenticity.
I think that operating from, I don't know, some kind of radical tenderness, you know, in the relation of the dialogue with each like process. For example, for the knife, like it was like an inheritance from my stepfather, so I wasn't going to completely destroy the knife. So this, so the transmission of whatever like love or care that was like endowed on that piece also is carried with that. So I think it's like so this precision of this, like the tongue of the Mexican calendar, you know, it's like it's a knife of obsidian. It has a face on it. So it's kind of this, the precision of the word, you know, like, of the precision of like the cut of an arrow. So it's and that's your poetics. That's like your highest poetics. Toltec wisdom. So in Vienna, in Austria, there's a world museum where there's housed like everything, all the stolen treasures of the world, the colonized world, like the last treasures of the last king of Africa, and you know, that died incarcerated in Great Britain with his family. Yeah, so like, their treasures, like bones from the Amazons and small skulls. Yeah, so yeah, some highest treasures there were some totems that I found were like in the Mexican section. They were, they just seemed very powerful, you know. Like I don't know how to explain it. They just had like a very strong presence and aura, like all around them. So those are the banners that are hanging in the gallery, and they are in dialogue. Like we're in dialogue, so the only altar that could be there, because they wouldn't permit like any altars to be placed in the museum for like the Moctezuma's like headdress and such. But yeah, so for me it was like with words. So like there's a dialogue there, there's a connection. And I told her who I am, what I'm doing, why I'm doing that. So I think it's a lot about the purpose, is about like your grounding force. So words are driving that energy of whatever rage or whatever comes up from that. But it's not, because it's like, it's still alive in me. So like, they can't take away the connection of telepathy or the word, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like, fuck you, and that's
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that kind of brings me, I want to think again, like a little bit about after image and this idea of after image. Yeah, but like, you know, television functions through, and it's sort of like our screen minds function through. And this, yeah, this idea of being after the image of, you know, like, that there are like images of our ancestors or images of our, you know, sort of demographic peers that are imbued with this sort of currency of suffering, you know, a currency of non-agentiality or a currency of or like displacement, and how this sort of after image, like being once removed from a generation or being in a position to say study indigeneity from like an urban place, from the position of being like an urban producer, or like a producer in a, you know, empirical empire whatever. Here. What that is, like how that sits, I guess, you know, like, I guess I'm asking about your processes and your practices too, like what it is to, so I know in my collage practice, this idea, this feeling of living after image produces almost like, again, to sort of talk back to Ernst, a schizophrenia, you know, so this idea of like also being, like you said, in this interstitial space where we're constantly in between, a kind of, yeah, like a radical intimacy with varying historical others, like, or even our like direct ancestral others, and then this this sort of like space of resistance and martyrdom, like what that spiral is and how we're producing images in that spiral.
I mean, very, very directly, I think a lot of the stillness in my work again deals with this. I think very specifically like the after image, like being present in this moment of after the image of being murdered, at this moment where life isn't completely gone and life isn't completely there. I think I remain very present in that moment a lot.
If there's anything I want you to do right now, it's just relax. I just want to stress that you are a shitty person.
I think specifically with the Sedia, I mean, kind of I've moved a little bit since then, I think a little bit more. But specifically I was thinking about like the moment of complete stillness, like almost like reaching a form of meditation, but also being a moment of complete lack of life. In like this moment in that most of us have seen through the annihilation of like black bodies, this moment of stillness, like teetering right on the border.
I was also just thinking how we've grown up with television for, you know, younger generations with all sorts of screens, and thinking about these moments of stillness, like even stillness has its time capacity, and like that awareness of like what's next, or what's on the next channel, or, you know, what will be the next scroll. Our concept of time, I think, is very interesting in regards to our, you know, our development and our worldview as well. And I mean, all the works, I feel like, could be almost time-based works, or be considered time-based works in a sense. You know, even Yuen's performance that we cut down for the purpose of exhibition, but the whole thing is about an hour long, and, you know, to really get a feel for it, you have to sit there and see it, but it was a quick edit, speed this up, do that, and we'll just with it.
Each of the works, and Sylvie's work as well, like,
Yes.
not to leave that out, but do contain multi-generational, multi-generational sort of like affects, whether they're objects, literal people, or like conditions, like that the generations have been affected by. There is this sense of a condensed time window, and then sort of like bouncing the echo, the rebirth off of those sorts of sites of origin, those like affective origin points, which I think is really interesting.
I feel like that echo or reverb is almost happening in this visual dialogue instead of just a direct language, but I think a lot of the other artists do have like a lot more present, like direct language, but I think it's nice to see us moving through text to a visual language and understanding that that's okay as well, that's just as like acceptable. I feel like it's also nice to have like longer time-based pieces because a lot of times we are, like marginalized bodies are confronted with bringing their culture to the forefront immediately. And it's like maybe Matthew Barney has like how long? 18 hours. And it's like, I understand that like,
well,
part of my videos
Roots is 6 hours. Yeah,
Well,
literally,
that's
cycles like
but it's like, some of my pieces are intended to be longer, a lot of them, maybe with time restraints on like the actual like film. But it's like, am I not allowed to be boring also? Or like, you're just staring at my body just laying there. I understand it's not going to be the most engaging, but it does somehow tap into like a deeper level of thought, or that's at least what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, Sylvie, the beginning of Sylvie's work, they show themselves like kind of being like filming an island, and it's a nice moment of just being present. Again, present, but of being present with someone who's migrating. Like a sense of, again, a spatio-temporal like sort of distortion. That I don't know what the point. I don't know. Yeah. So maybe the last question, and then we maybe take some questions, is thinking about that sense of echo, like the wall that the echo has to hit to throw back to the listener, and the sort of like caverns now of like all of our different individual encounters with the state, with history, with self, as these sort of walls, So I'm thinking again, also within the process of producing image and the process of making something seen, making the unseen seen, presencing the thing, representing the thing, re-encountering historical trauma, making something contemporary, and the power that these sort of technological interventions have on our ability to, in mass, in populist settings. Also this idea of the part of public opinion, to sway public opinion. The walls that we're hitting now are sort of like the cavern is being made clear, like by the sort of racket caused through these interventions and these sort of reassertions of time and temporality. So I guess I'm kind of going to ask the question about the market and about the logic of law, Where do you see this work hitting, and who is it bouncing back to? I know that like it's sort of like the question of the contemporary now is like what audience, who was your audience, And a lot of the work that people are doing in different archives and like especially micro archives is asking this question of like, or trying to sort of make the audience smaller, to resist synchronization, to resist mainstreaming, to resist normalization, and therefore resist different means of oppression and repression. But as Du Bois says, the market is one that exists through various repressions, right? So like this idea of creating a work of fine art, or creating a piece, an image, a film, performance work, and the sort of the budgeting, the time, those things, like those aspects of actual production. Where are the walls? Like where are the walls, and like is that something that we should carry radically intimately into considerations, like aesthetic considerations? That's a long question.
I think to kind of get back to the previous question to answer this is that I think thinking a lot of negotiating between stillness and movement, but then also thinking about slowness and time.
ស្រឡាញ់គ្នាគូស្នេហ៍នឹងយ៉ាងម៉េចអត់ដឹងទេអាយុ18 19ឆ្នាំអីហ្នឹងអត់ដឹងទេមិនដឹងថាស្នេហានឹងជាស្អីផងអាយុ14 15ឆ្នាំហើយនៅលោតទឹកស្រាតដែរណោះបងម៉ាក់មែនយ៉ាបង បងប្រុសម៉ាក់នោះនៅលោតទឹកស្រាតក្ដុងក្ដុងដែលមានផោស្លីអី
ក្ដុងក្ដុង
យ៉ានោះនៅលោតទឹកនេះអីចឹង
យ៉ា
លោតទឹកស្រះហើយបងប្រុសម៉ាក់លោតទឹកស្រះដឹងមិនលោតពីចុង7ធ្លាក់ទៅប្រហែលជាពៀនពៀនជាពៀន
It's this kind of stretching and delay of time in order to kind of collapse things. And I think where all the walls is, I think what you touched on earlier is radical intimacy, these opportunities for stillness in order to allow sound to hit the wall and reverberate back and establish the echo. And I think it's a constant negotiation between like who is the audience, and for me, I think my work and this video/performance piece of me carrying my mother on my back in order to understand her history and archive the family history in order to contribute to a larger and mostly erased history. It's a personal act, but also that I think establishes in what we talked about in I was in a course with Kandis last semester, but talking a lot about the act of witnessing and witnessing things together. So it's an opportunity to witness this history and with my mother and I, but then also to in some way document and archive in order for other acts of witnessing together to happen as well.
I like watching this stillness of the body. Like I always thought it was romantic somehow. You know? Like I think I was like a child and I would play dead and it was like gratifying. You know? Or yeah. So I think that this, the more that the lines are also blurred between the works, but like ourselves, and ourselves watching these things, like all those just become like, different like electrons like hitting each other, and causing some static, something like a movement within. So it's not like tangible. It's like a rippling.
The interior architecture. Yeah.
Just to add on to that, say blurring the audience is part of that radical intimacy, where there is no clear barrier. There's a sort of dissolvement of viewership and what is being viewed, and it just becomes one. I think that's the beautiful thing about a lot of performance too. And again, like time-based works where people have to really be present or aware of the present in things that are long or have a certain length, or that will have people sit and be in one spot and really have to feel all the twitches in their bodies or every sort of emotion that might come up, whether it's a yawn or feeling boredom or anything like that, but it's being very in that presence. And I guess that's like, in a way, that's a small way to combat this greater market that you were discussing.
The market that is essentially also like predictively consuming the same archive, or these more degraded archives, right? Like, that's another.
Yeah, because what happens when you don't have anyone to sell to?
Yeah.
That's the dream, isn't it?
Right, yeah, that's the dream.
Yeah.